Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CSIS virtual studio for what will be, I think, a really fascinating event on the Black Sea and Black Sea security. Joining me today is Jeff Mankoff and Lisa Aronsson, both doctors, I should say. They are here to really talk about what is, I think, a really important report that was produced earlier this year titled The Inhospitable Sea Toward a New U.S. Strategy for the Black Sea Region. And with everything happening with the war in Ukraine, lots of naval activity, as well as U.S. relations with Georgia, with Turkey, and other Black Sea countries, the Black Sea, I think, is incredibly important to not just U.S. security, not just European security, but to global security. Let me give a quick background on our guests. Dr. Lisa Aronsson, who's a research fellow at the Center for Strategic Research at the Institute for National Strategic Studies at National Defense University. She's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where she's affiliated with the Transatlantic Security Initiative in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Lisa has more than 10 years of experience working in think tanks, government, and universities in the United States and Europe. Lisa, welcome back to CSIS. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Max. Thanks for having us.
Next, Jeff Mankoff is a senior associate with the CSIS Russia and Eurasia Program. And before coming to CSIS, he served as an advisor on U.S.-Russia relations at the U.S. Department of State as a Council on Foreign Relations International Fellow. And from 2008 to 2010, he was Associate Director of International Security Studies at Yale University and an Adjunct Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and he is also with the National Defense University, I should say. Both are here in their individual capacity. And as I mentioned, the report that you authored earlier this year, I think, is incredibly pertinent, which is part of the reason for having this event, given everything that's happening in the Black Sea. With both the suspension of the grain deal, with sort of continuous naval conflict. So maybe let's just jump right into it. Lisa, if I could start with you to maybe sort of outline the basic tenets of the report. What prompted you both to write this report, and what is the strategic significance that you see of the Black Sea region?
Sure. Thanks, Max. Thanks again so much for having us, and thanks so much for the opportunity to publish this study with CSIS. It's great to be here. Just for a little bit of background, Jeff and I were struck by the fact that from an alliance perspective, at least some years ago, there was a lot more attention to the Nordic and the Baltic region as after the annexation of Crimea. That's where the alliance really concentrated its efforts to reassure the allies and strengthen defense and deterrence. But the Southeast Europe seemed like it needed a little bit more strategic attention. So that was the origins. And then I must say, for me personally, I listened to a hearing for the Subcommittee on Europe and Regional Security Cooperation in October of 2021, and the witnesses were Ian Brzezinski, Alina Polyakova, and Jim Townsend. The three of them gave excellent testimony. Were very convincing that there was a sort of overwhelming need for a U.S. Comprehensive regional strategy towards the Black Sea that really went beyond the military domain and encompassed the economic issues, democratic resilience, energy issues, and really took the hybrid threats or the unconventional threats seriously and head on. And so we tracked the legislation put forward by Senators Shaheen and Senator Romney, who managed to get that into the FY23 defense bill, requiring an interagency Black Sea strategy. And when we started this, it was actually before the Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine in 2021. So our intention was actually to go to Ukraine and spend some time working there on this topic. But then when we couldn't do that, we pivoted to look a little bit more at the wider region. So I think we hoped that this study would be a helpful part of the thinking to help inform a U.S. comprehensive Black Sea strategy. I don't know if you want to add something to that, Jeff.
Sure. So I think the differences in the way that NATO prioritized responding to the Northeast and the Southeast in the wake of the 2014 annexation of Crimea was really striking, and that the comparative lack of attention to the Southeast was a vulnerability that affected not only Ukraine but a number of NATO members as well. And in a way, it's not surprising that the northeast flank, so the Baltic states and Poland, was the priority when NATO was developing its new force posture in the wake of the 2014 annexation of Crimea. Southeastern Europe, the Black Sea region, is strategically very complex. Some of the countries in the region are NATO members, Romania and Bulgaria and Turkey. Some are aspiring NATO members, Ukraine and Georgia. And then you also have Russia, which is very much a part of the Black Sea picture. But even among the NATO members and aspiring members, there's not a unity of purpose or unity of vision when it comes to how do you respond to the conventional and hybrid threats that the region faces. And so just getting everybody on the same page, just having a clear picture of what the nature of the threat is and how to respond to it is in a lot of ways much more complicated in this part of the world than it is in the Baltic states and Poland. And so we really felt that some new thinking was needed in terms of how the United States and NATO together should be involved and how they could work to provide stability and security in the region. And this, again, as Lisa said, was even before the outbreak of the full-scale war in Ukraine. And I think everything that's happened since February 2022 only reinforces the importance of the Black Sea and the importance of figuring out what a long-term picture for stabilization and security looks like.
Yeah, you have a sort of I think a really important quote in the report. Journalist Maximilian Hess writes that an astonishing 10 wars have taken place on or near the Black Sea littoral since the end of the Cold War, more than in any other maritime space in the world. And I think does this sort of speak to the kind of elephant in the sea, so to put it awkwardly, that this is about Russia wanting to sort of maintain the Black Sea essentially as a Russian lake, what it essentially was during the Soviet period, and that Russia trying to exert control over many of its neighbors, and that Russian activity to maintain its presence, assert control, undermine NATO is kind of the key threat. I mean, we're to sort of leave Ukraine aside right now, which is maybe a little difficult to do. Is that the key challenge, that we're really talking about Russia's presence in the Black Sea?
I think that's maybe, as you put it, the elephant in the sea. That's certainly the biggest threat to regional stability and security, but it's not the only one. I mean, the fact that you do have this real regional fragmentation and a divergence of views makes regional cooperation much harder. You know, not only do you have the 10 conflicts that have taken place since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the region, you also have internal fragmentation in a number of the countries. And can we get the map up here, maybe?
Yeah, if we can pull up the map, we'll have an interactive map for.
Yeah, so you know, you can see these areas that are sort of colored pink here. These are all areas where you have protracted or frozen conflicts that have been active since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and Russia has been in various ways involved in or fueling some of these conflicts, but they also have their own internal dynamics, and they've all been sources of instability that have made it more difficult for these countries to cooperate with one another or to pursue their aspirations of a deeper relationship with Euro-Atlantic structures. And so that has made it harder, and this whole region has really been on the front lines of the strategic competition between Russia and the West, between Russia and NATO. You know, NATO and the European Union have developed pretty comprehensive partnership agreements with states like Moldova, Georgia, Armenia. But because of the geopolitical complexity of the region, have not been able to go beyond that kind of halfway status where they're partners but don't really have a path directly into the alliance. Meanwhile, Russia's revisionist aspirations focus on making it more difficult, if not impossible, for these countries to join NATO or the European Union. So this region really has become sort of a front line in that strategic competition.
Right, so if we sort of go through these, we have Moldova and Transnistria, we have Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia, where the 2008 war, Russia then essentially has occupied those territories since, with Abkhazia being on the Black Sea itself. And then, of course, Nagorno-Karabakh, the disputed territory between Armenia and Azerbaijan, which just today has erupted in violence once again. Lisa, maybe over to you to sort of elaborate on some of the strategic importance of this region, some of the threats and challenges.
Sure. I actually wanted to follow up on the last question as well. When we think about this region, obviously there is a fault line with Russia that Russia is an instigator in some ways of all of these conflicts. But there's also a part of this that is about the Euro-Atlantic infrastructure, which I think of in this region as kind of unfinished business, which is of increasingly urgent nature and increasingly important for regional stability and security. For me, for this study, I focused on Romania and Bulgaria, both of which are strongly committed to their Euro-Atlantic orientation, but are facing quite different sets of challenges in terms of strengthening rule of law, democracy, their information environment, and their integration fully into the EU. In EU, for example, through their continued exclusion from Schengen, there are lots of challenges there. And then from a NATO perspective, they join the alliance with the mindset as a net security recipient. And so there's still some unfinished business in terms of helping to develop these countries into contributors to the alliance, because that's what's required of NATO membership. And so you see a lot of investment in modernization in Romania and also in Bulgaria, though it faces quite different political challenges. So there's a sense of unfinished business from my perspective in looking at this region. Also, perhaps most importantly, was the alliance's Bucharest summit declaration promise that Georgia and Ukraine would one day become members. And for the EU, now we have 2 new candidate countries in the region. So I think it's important that we don't only think about this as a strategic competition, which of course it is, but as what do the Euro-Atlantic institutions have to do to sort of consolidate their strength and resilience in this region and build a sense of a regional dialogue that cuts across some of the areas where you see this fragmentation between NATO members and partner states and the different national perspectives on the conflicts there.
Right, and I think it's a very important point with Romania, Bulgaria, and especially Turkey, all NATO countries in the Black Sea, and we've tended to have thought of the potential flashpoint between Russia and NATO over Ukraine was going to be an incident maybe with Poland. There was a Ukrainian missile that went off course and landed in Poland and killed Polish civilians. But if that was a Russian missile, what would have been the implications? Well, what we're seeing right now, particularly along the Danube Delta, where that's how Ukraine is sort of getting a lot of its grain to market, are Russian missile attacks on Ukrainian territory, but right along NATO territory, right along the Romanian border, creating a real sense of insecurity. But I'm curious, NATO's presence in the region prior to the war was rather limited, wasn't it? I mean, NATO, at port facilities, this was not sort of major top of the agenda for NATO before this war, was it?
That's right. And I can say from my travel to the region there, I very much got the sense that Romania and Bulgaria are frontline states still, even though there's for Romania, it's a frontline state on the maritime. It has a maritime and air borders effectively with Russia when planes take off from MK or they're within striking distance almost immediately. Bulgaria is a frontline state in a different way through largely hybrid threats. It's under constant hybrid threat as a result of the political instability and the corruption. So my sense there was that these are very much frontline states in this conflict. The alliance, it's not fair to say it did nothing for the Southeast. There is, of course, the tailored forward presence that was in place, and there has been a lot of buildup of allied presence in Romania.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about the tailored forward presence.
That's right. I think it was after maybe you correct me, was it Warsaw? I can't remember which summit it was. Warsaw Summit, where there was a much smaller allied presence in the Southeast, which was, let's say, less capable than the enhanced forward presence in the Northeast, but was still something. But I think the the degree to which the alliance could put forces in place there was limited due to the political fragmentation, particularly between Turkey, Bulgaria, and Romania. But after the Russia's full-scale invasion, now of course we've rebalanced that with 4 additional battle groups now down, covering the central part of the front and then Southeast Europe. So,
And one of the reasons why I think the Black Sea matters so much is, of course, this is the sea access, the port access for Romania, for Ukraine, for Georgia. This is how goods get to market through the Bosphorus Straits in Istanbul. And maybe you could talk about, Jeff or Lisa, the current kind of security challenges that are confronting many of these countries. Let's sort of leave Ukraine aside for now. But if you're shipping goods from Georgia out, what are some of the issues? Is the kind of security of the Black Sea in a kind of free and open Black Sea, that's really in question right now, isn't it?
Yeah, so ever since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and the 2 eastern oblasts in Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk, it's been building up both its naval presence and its naval defense, shore defense capabilities in these regions. And so effectively Russia now has naval predominance in the Black Sea in a way that it didn't before 2014, and it has the ability to hold at risk shipping from any of these states that are seeking to move goods through the Black Sea. And so that means that to the extent that anybody wants to move things in the region, they have to do it sort of with Russian assent. Mm-hmm. And that's been really a problem, especially for Ukraine, but it also affects the strategic calculations of these other countries as well, because how they calibrate their own relationships with Russia is dependent to a significant degree on their willingness to take risks and to allow their own assets, their own transit routes to be held at risk. And so one of the things that we've seen is there's been a much greater shift, a much greater emphasis on east-west transit. This is something that actually the European Union has really prioritized as it sought to reduce its dependence on Russia as a supplier of hydrocarbons. And so a lot of the alternative sources of supply are going to be coming across these east-west routes, particularly the so-called middle corridor that goes through the Caucasus. But the ability of that to function in some ways depends on the ability to maintain security of communication across the Black Sea. And so to the extent that Russia can hold those transit routes, those lines of communication at risk, it's a significant problem for not just the states in the region, but also for European consumers.
Yeah, you mentioned, I think in the report, that Russia could even just sort of do snap military or naval mm-hmm. exercises mm-hmm. and suddenly close off access to the Black Sea for many of these countries. So just ensuring that countries have to have positive relations with Russia in order to simply get goods to market becomes, I think, a real point of leverage for Russia.
Yeah, I also just wanted to add, we tend to follow the war in Ukraine with a focus on the red lines where they're moving on the territory of Ukraine. But I think it's important to also remember that the maritime environment, the Black Sea, has been a staging grounds for Russia all this time. Ukrainians have been very successful with their coastal defense and anti-ship missiles, but still Russia will continue. Whatever happens in the land war, they will continue to try to dominate the Black Sea, if only to strangle the Ukrainian economic recovery or to try to prevent or challenge its integration into the Euro-Atlantic infrastructure. Or to undermine the alliance or EU unity as a whole. So whatever happens in the territory of Ukraine, it's important to be cognizant of the balance of power here and how Russia uses naval hybrid operations mm-hmm. to achieve its strategic objectives in other ways.
Yeah, and I would just add to that there's been a significant naval component to the war in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. On the Russian side, the use of naval artillery to strike targets on land. There were efforts early in the war to do maritime landings, particularly at Odessa, which failed, and also on Snake Island, which was successful for a brief period. But the ability to continue using those naval platforms as a form of artillery, a form of force multiplication to strike targets on land, is one of the things that has complicated Ukrainians' ability to defend and to succeed in their counteroffensive. The Ukrainians have had some important successes, obviously sinking the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva, and just recently carrying out a strike on the main Russian port on Crimea and Sevastopol that basically damaged 2 ships beyond repair. But despite these sort of tactical successes, Russia still maintains that strike capability in the Black Sea. It still controls egress through the Sea of Azov, which is a critical economic lifeline for Ukraine. And so as long as Russia has these naval capabilities in play, it's going to be really hard for Ukraine to regain the full connectivity to global markets that it had before the war started, and certainly before 2014 when Russia started moving into Donetsk and Luhansk.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about how Russia has presence in the Black Sea has sort of evolved, particularly since 2014. Your report goes and outlines kind of the addition of maritime, of naval vessels, its seizure of Crimea sort of really expanded Russia's presence. But maybe you could talk a little bit how between 2014 and 2022, what did we see from Russia in the Black Sea?
Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, there was a significant militarization of Crimea. Crimea, of course, when it was under Ukrainian territory, when it was under Ukrainian
Control.
sovereignty, control, that meant that Russia's military presence in the Black Sea was comparatively limited. Its only major port facility was Novorossiysk in the Far East, and it didn't have assets that could range the entire territory, the entire scope of the Black Sea. With the annexation of Crimea, Russia increasingly not only took over the assets that were already based in Crimea, but it increasingly militarized the peninsula as well. So moving in air defense, coastal defense, and then building up its naval capacity as well, in addition to the Ukrainian platforms that it just took over. So now the balance of power in the Black Sea has shifted rather substantially. And this is a problem. Back in 2016, President Erdogan said that the Black Sea was turning into a Russian lake, and developments over the subsequent 6-7 years have only sort of reinforced that concern. And so the longer that the war goes on, the more that Russia devotes to building up its naval capacity, which is one of the priorities in its rearmament program, the more that this is going to be a problem.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about the role of Turkey here because I want to talk more about the kind of current context with the war and also with the grain deal. But the role of Turkey seems incredibly important in the Black Sea. Obviously, it controls access through the Montreux Convention, I think of 1936. Maybe you could, Lisa or Jeff, talk a bit about Turkey's perspective and what is their position and role here when it comes to Black Sea security.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Turkey's role is very complicated in this conflict and on the larger question of Black Sea security. So Turkey is a NATO member. Its relationship with the NATO alliance and with a number of its members has been difficult for a number of years. Even before the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, even before 2014, Turkey's emphasis in the Black Sea was on a kind of regional condominium approach. So having the countries in the region cooperate to maintain security. And it was a sponsor for a number of regional security mechanisms like the Black Sea Economic Cooperation, the Black Sea Harmony, military exercises, and various other initiatives. Even after the annexation of Crimea and the sort of split between the West and Russia that emerged after 2014, Turkey tried to adhere as much as possible to that approach, even as the recognition was growing that given the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, that kind of cooperative or condominium approach wasn't going to be viable anymore. So under the Montreux Convention, Turkey controls egress into the Black Sea through the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits. And that means that it has the ability during wartime to limit the presence of non-littoral state warships in the Black Sea. Early on in the conflict, Turkey invoked this provision, which meant that Russia has been unable to move ships from other locations, principally the Eastern Mediterranean, where a lot of its naval forces were engaged in Syria, into the Black Sea. But it also means that the NATO alliance can't reinforce its presence there either, other than the littoral states, so Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey itself. That approach is one that, for different reasons, both Ukraine and Russia have approved and appreciated. For Russia, it basically means that the current balance of power in the Black Sea remains. The United States and other NATO allies are not going to be moving significant amounts of military materiel into the Black Sea because Turkey's not going to allow them to do that. That obviously constrains the options that are available to the alliance in terms of responding to Russian actions. On the other hand, as I said, it means that Russia can't reinforce its Black Sea presence either. So, much of the Russian Mediterranean squadron that was engaged in the conflict in Syria hasn't been able to move into the Black Sea either. Now, there's some, wiggle room around this, and there have been reports of, Russia moving military equipment on civilian ships and sort of Turkey turning a blind eye to that sort of thing. But nevertheless, the balance of power in the Black Sea has roughly been maintained since the start of the war because of Turkey's adherence to the Montreux Convention. Turkey's position in the conflict is effectively that it would like to see Ukraine win. It supports Ukraine's territorial integrity, but that it doesn't want to see Russia suffer a catastrophic defeat. It doesn't want to see instability in Russia, and it wants to maintain its own relationship with Russia, which puts it at odds with a number of the other NATO allies, especially because Turkey has been benefiting in various ways from the conflict, whether that's influx of Russian money, whether that is efforts by Russian entities and Russian business people to evade sanctions by moving goods through Turkey, whether that's profiting from the import of grain that Russian forces have stolen from Ukraine. So Turkey's playing a very kind of mixed role in the conflict, and that is in line with its larger strategic ambitions of establishing itself as a major regional power. And that kind of holds the balance of power in the wider region and engages both with NATO, of which it remains a member, and with Russia.
Lisa, that seems to really constrain NATO in the Black Sea.
Yeah, I've been thinking about what, how the alliance might tackle the maritime insecurity and the freedom of navigation issues in the Black Sea. And of course, Romania has long been calling for more NATO presence, more U.S. engagements, more NATO presence, including for a Black Sea flotilla some years ago, which didn't go over in part because of the current Bulgarian government and the political turmoil and the complexity of the political and information environment in Bulgaria, and of course, because of Turkey, which has prioritized in terms of its own strategic priorities the Mediterranean and the Syria conflict. So the alliance is up against a lot of headwinds in trying to establish more of an allied presence in the Black Sea. That said, I think there is more that can be done. I think for now we see ships moving through the territorial waters and potentially eventually through the EEZs. There's sort of a stopgap solution that hopefully can continue for the sake of the people who depend on those grains exports. But there is more I think the alliance can do to establish a continuous maritime presence that would be organized by the littoral states and supported by others, of course. Turkey would, at least at the beginning, have to take a lead. So I think the challenge is to figure out how to find a mechanism to set this up that Turkey would accept. Romania and Bulgaria are, investing in their maritime capabilities. They're starting from a pretty low point, but I think if there's something the alliance could do and that the U.S. could do, would be to help them to build up their naval capabilities, especially also coastal defense, air defense, and then also there's work to be done, I think, to overcome the fragmentation of the region and to try to build a shared assessment of what's going on in the Black Sea, at least amongst the three NATO allies, but also with the partners on the other side. And that can be done through more intelligence sharing, more intelligence gathering, more intelligence sharing, better platforms for that. And that's something where I think the U.S. and the alliance can really take a lead. But of course, there are political headwinds, Turkey will have to be engaged in a leadership role, at least at the beginning, and so that could take some time.
Yeah, if I could just
Yeah,
jump
go
in real
ahead.
quick, I think this point about coastal and air defense is really important. The Black Sea is an enclosed sea, so the distances are not as great as they would be in the open ocean. And what we've seen from the Ukrainians is the ability to impose significant costs on Russia just using coastal and naval defense, as well as seaborne drones. And so these are the kind of things that could be provided to the littoral states in ways that are compliant with the Montreux Convention that could actually have a significant impact in terms of improving their security and improving their ability to defend the coastal reaches and hold Russian assets at risk.
Yeah, well, one point that was made to me by a senior Romanian official recently is that the EU also through Frontex, which is this new sort of custom and border service, essentially, actually had one of its drones basically harassed by Russia. But that's another, this is also, a border of the European Union, exclusive economic zone with Romania and Bulgaria being part of the European Union, and potentially EU resources as well could be directed toward enhancing their security and protection in the region. Maybe let's turn to Ukraine and how the kind of war has played out. Obviously, Russia used Crimea as sort of a launching pad for its invasion from the south, was quite successful in the south, but has also used its naval presence in Crimea and in the Black Sea to launch sea-based strikes on Ukrainian infrastructure, Ukrainian military targets, as well as infrastructure, power plants and other areas. But now we've seen Ukraine kind of hit back. Jeff, you mentioned the Moskva sinking. That was it now feels so long ago.
Time ago.
But recently, the Ukrainians' use of kind of hybrid tactics of unmanned at-water vehicles, as well as potential cruise missiles themselves, to target Russian ships, both at sea and docked in Crimea. How do you see the kind of current state of play in the Black Sea and from a naval warfare perspective when it comes to Ukraine and Russia?
Yeah. So I think the big picture in the war is that it's not going to end anytime soon. I think Ukraine is showing that it's developing capabilities to target Russian assets well behind the front lines and to degrade them to some degree. But Russia maintains the capacity to strike Ukraine in pretty significant depth and significant strength as well. And the damage that Russia is able to inflict on Ukrainian infrastructure, including grain export terminals and storage sites, is taking a real toll on the Ukrainian economy. And I think that that's probably going to continue. And much of that is, as you said, being done from naval platforms. So, I don't have a particularly optimistic take on, what the next 6 months are going to bring. Of course, the Ukrainians are conducting this well-known counteroffensive on land, primarily in southeastern Ukraine, and they've made some modest gains, but certainly nothing that has fully pierced the Russian lines or threatened Russian territorial control of the bulk of the regions that they've occupied since the beginning of the war. The weather is changing. I think the season for offensive operations is going to end here in the next month or so. So probably Ukraine will have won back some territory on land, but the front lines are not going to shift appreciably, and Russia still has the capacity to regenerate forces. There's a push now for another wave of mobilization going on in Russia. There's the potential deal with North Korea for additional ammunition. And we've seen reports that Russia's own defense production has increased substantially this year. Now, how sustainable that is over the longer term, perhaps, is another question. But certainly for the next 6 to 12 months, I don't think that either the front lines or the Russian defense economy are going to break down in such a way that there's going to be a real collapse along the front like we saw, say, in 1917.
But it does strike me that naval balance may have shifted a bit, where, I think before it seemed Russia had clear dominance at the sea. There was the sinking of the Moskva seems sort of like a big shock, surprise that Ukraine could strike a ship at sea. But now it seems the balance has maybe shifted, and I'm curious about the long-term presence of Russia's ability to continue to station incredibly expensive, valuable naval assets in Crimea that are potentially clear. Well, there are clear targets, but also in reach of Ukrainian efforts, and what that means for Russia's longer-term naval presence in Crimea.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. And, after the sinking of the Moskva, the Russians pulled a lot of their platforms back to Novorossiysk, into the eastern part of the Black Sea. I think as Crimea becomes more in range of Ukrainian capabilities, it is going to be more difficult for Russia to maintain a significant, not only naval, but also land-based presence on the peninsula. But again, I don't see this changing in a completely fundamental way in the next 6 months or maybe even the next 12 months.
I can also add to that. I mean, we were discussing this yesterday. I think you're right. There is a change in the balance of power at sea in Ukraine's favor as a result of how effective it has been in holding the Russian Navy at bay. However, I think that's a little bit too simple a perspective, and that actually the way Russia's power is leveraged across the sea overlaps so much with the way it's weaponizing the export of fuel and grains and agricultural products, and the way that it is strategically using strategic corruption to try to capture elites, to try to steer decision making even within NATO allies towards its objectives. And as you said, the way that it is calling and then calling off exercises, oftentimes into the EEZs of NATO allies. So there is another, and we haven't even talked about the underwater capabilities or Russian submarines, and we have now a new NATO cell for dealing with critical undersea infrastructure, which is a great addition. But it's too simple to say that the balance of power, that Russia is being pushed back. There are a lot of other tools that they are using to exert power across this region. Another thing I wanted to say on the previous topic, when we started this research, I think we couldn't have foreseen how important Ukraine's victory would be for all of the other recommendations that we have in this report. Earlier, yesterday, I was looking at a NATO Parliamentary Assembly report that came out in May that is excellent. I recommend that you read it. It says this war in Ukraine is now the most disruptive war since World War II, with the outcome of having the ability to have an implications at a sort of systems level. I think this is really true for this region. Not only is the sea the sort of staging ground, has it been for Ukraine, we also haven't talked about the 4 or 5 times they've tried to capture Snake Island, albeit eventually unsuccessfully. But now it's clear that the region is really important for energy, for grains, for fuel, and so it's effectively been globalized, as we also see the debates about who's signing up for sanctions and who's not, and how is Russia using the information tools elsewhere in the world. So I think we have 5 recommendations there, and all of which in some way depend on a favorable outcome, an acceptable outcome for Ukraine, and a defeat of this Russian sort of imperialist mindset.
I want to go through the recommendations, but maybe we could talk. We haven't yet talked about the grain deal, and it's both successful formation and then now the collapse of the grain deal. Ukraine, in the report, identifies, I think, 95% of Ukrainian grain would come out by the sea. It strikes me that both Black Sea access is critical to Ukraine's economic future, but it's not only about Ukraine having access to the Black Sea through the Dnieper River and other waterways, but it's also critical that it be able to get its goods when in the Black Sea out through the Bosphorus into markets. Now, The collapse of the deal has brought sort of an escalation of Russian attacks on Ukrainian ports along the Danube, as I mentioned next by Romania, and then also some challenges to Ukrainian commercial shipping that to bring goods out of Ukraine and out of the Black Sea. How do you see this currently playing out? Because this strikes me as a potential flashpoint that, Russian kind of meddling and attacks on commercial shipping does strike me as something that would potentially prompt a stronger NATO response to sort of say, no, you cannot, interrupt international commerce. So I'm curious for your all reactions to the grain deal, and what do you see currently with the current state of play?
Go ahead.
Go for it.
From my perspective, Russia will always want to limit Ukraine's ability to export grain. So this is also a longer-term challenge that will take some time. Kyiv needs to have options for exports via the territorial waters. I don't think the Danube Delta ports are enough. I think there's a need for massive investments in infrastructure in Romania and Bulgaria, not only for military mobility, but for finding alternative export routes for Ukrainian grain. For now, territorial waters, hopefully eventually EEZs, that there needs to be another path for this. Ideally, eventually, as we were talking about earlier, a continuous NATO presence of some sort that is within expanded exercises. There are lots of things that the alliance can do within the Montreux Convention's restrictions, but eventually this needs to be through stronger navies and stronger naval collaboration, and that's just something that's going to take time.
Yeah, I would add that both Russia and Ukraine are major grain exporters, and there are a number of countries, particularly in the Middle East, that have been dependent on grain from these two countries for a long, long time. And the interruption of the grain deal and the targeting of Ukrainian grain export capabilities has put a lot of pressure on the economies and potentially social stability in some of these countries. So places like Egypt and Lebanon, even some of the more wealthy countries in the Middle East are facing these kind of pressures. So I think this is a risky strategy for Russia over the longer term. It originally signed up to the Black Sea grain deal, in part due to the mediation, the intervention of Turkey and the United Nations. And Turkey is another one of those countries that has benefited from, being able to trade both Russian and Ukrainian grain. So in some ways it was seen, I think, as a concession almost to President Erdogan for Russia to sign up to this deal in the first place. And now, having pulled out of it, it faces pressure from Turkey, but also from some of these other states. Putin and Erdogan met not that long ago, and President Erdogan confirmed that this was one of the top issues that he raised in the conversation, trying to get Putin to go back into the grain deal, but was unable to do it. And now you're starting to see more of a backlash against Russia in some of these Middle Eastern countries, even in places like India that have been pretty supportive of Russia, in part because of their own concerns about what the withdrawal from the grain deal means for grain prices, inflation, and potentially stability in their own countries. So this is a risky strategy for Russia. I think it's one that Moscow hopes will have a significant short-term impact, because I think the longer it goes on, the more complications it's going to cause for Moscow's strategy.
And let me add, just also looking from the alliance perspective, just yesterday, Bulgarian grain producers were out protesting effectively against Ukrainian grain imports, effectively for higher costs for bread for Bulgarians, which is another way that, through political, effectively, and information hybrid warfare, that Russia can address, can try to pursue its interests within the alliance. We've seen a lot of these tensions over the exports of Ukrainian grain amongst NATO members.
Yeah, no, there's even amongst Ukraine's closest partners, Poland, Slovakia, others that EU countries that Ukrainian grain has been allowed into the EU single market, but that has depressed prices and then led to complaints among farmers in the East. But I think
that's why we need a comprehensive strategy.
Yes, and that is exactly where we're going. it does strike me, just to maybe conclude on Ukraine, that we tend to think of Ukrainian victory as meaning that Ukraine needs to take more territory on land, which I think is definitely true. It will need to be able to have freedom of movement on the Dnieper River, which is one of its major waterways. But then once it sort of takes back territory, it will also need the ability to transport its goods through the Black Sea. So the naval dimension for Ukrainian victory is going to be, I think, really critical. And so some of the naval action that we're seeing at least shows that Ukraine can be in the fight and hopefully take some of the fight to Russia. But maybe let's dive in to some of your recommendations about what you think a Black Sea strategy should see. What do you think that, frankly, if you were writing the U.S. government report, what are the recommendations that you guys would put forward, both from a U.S. perspective, but also from a NATO, from an alliance perspective?
Well, conveniently, we have these recommendations in our report, which we'd of course encourage everybody to read.
Yes.
Do you want to?
No, go
start?
for it.
Well, I was going to say, so there are 5 things that we really emphasize in the report. The first one is further strengthening the U.S. presence in the region through force deployments, weapon sales, diplomatic engagements, investment, and the like. And we've actually seen some of this since the outbreak of the conflict. But at the end of the day, because of the regional fragmentation, because of the divergent views that exist in the region, the U.S., even more so than in other places in the alliance, is going to have to take a leading role in terms of being active on the ground, in terms of diplomatic engagement, to make sure that countries that have these different views are able to cooperate, and in showing that it's committed to protecting and maintaining the security of these countries against the threats that they face from a more aggressive Russia. And this is true not only of NATO member states, but of some of the other regional countries as well. We haven't really talked about Georgia, but one of the big concerns in Georgia is that the war in Ukraine leaves it more vulnerable to Russian pressure. And so the current Georgian government has been tacking closer to Russia for a variety of reasons, but among those, to make sure that Russia doesn't have any excuse or justification for acting more aggressively against it. So I think that sense of insecurity that exists, in Georgia, but also in Moldova, and even in a country like Turkey, is something that I think only greater U.S. involvement, greater U.S. presence can help address in a way that's going to make these countries more confident and more capable of taking a strong stand against Russian aggression.
I also want to add, in the sort of preparations for this, I was expecting you to ask a question about a division of labor in terms of this comprehensive strategy between the U.S., NATO, and the EU. And I don't think that's the right framework for thinking about a strategy for this region. I mean, a division of labor between the alliance and the European Union. It's already such a fragmented region, and that's part of the reason why we haven't had more of a comprehensive strategy. Also, we've had a heavy security focus, which I think is understandable because of the war that's taking place, and it's important. But the challenges are much more diffuse, complex, and interconnected. So rather, I think the priority needs to be actually making sure that the efforts that the European Union and NATO undertake, which overlap, there's a lot to do on resilience, on economics, there's a lot. It's not so much exactly making sure that they're joined up and building knowledge, I think particularly in Western Europe and in the U.S., about the dynamics that are at play in the region and the complexities of the vulnerabilities there. Obviously, supporting Ukraine's immediate needs and future needs goes without saying. And then scaling up efforts to engage and support regional allies and partners, ultimately with one objective, which is to strengthen democratic governments, rule of law, and to promote stability and prosperity. So it's not so much about dividing up the tasks between NATO, the EU, and states, but figuring out how to build and share knowledge and to join them up, so we're all working towards the same objectives.
When it comes to Ukraine and support for Ukraine and Ukrainian security assistance, are there? It seems that most of the focus of U.S. support has really been on the land domain, and there's been concern about providing weapons to Ukraine that may hit Russian targets. But how do you think that should relate to Russian vessels at sea? Is that something that the U.S. should be doing more to support? Especially when we think about the unmanned drones. You know, the U.S. is not providing any support
Right.
for Ukrainian drone development to sort of target Moscow and Russian territory, but perhaps drones at sea is maybe a different story.
Yeah, I haven't thought about this a lot, but my inclination is to agree with you on this, to say that, you know, naval assets, of course, are legitimate military targets, especially to the extent that they're engaged in hostile combat operations. If you're striking them at sea, you're not hitting them on Russian territory. Russian civilians are not going to be killed. So, you know, I would think that would be perfectly legitimate and reasonable for the U.S. to provide Ukraine with knowledge and capabilities that could be used to strike Russian vessels at sea. As you've said, Ukraine, even without that kind of assistance, has developed pretty impressive capabilities in terms of unmanned surface vehicles, unmanned underwater vehicles, coastal defense facilities, and others, but certainly helping Ukraine enhance and develop those capabilities to make them more effective would certainly be among the list of things that I think the U.S. ought to consider.
From a diplomatic perspective, there's just been a big announced effort around the Atlantic where the United States is going to try to sort of organize all sort of countries with along the Atlantic Ocean together. But there doesn't seem that there's any sort of Black Sea organization or entity that, from a diplomatic perspective, you know, if you think about maybe the Arctic Council, that can bring countries together to discuss sort of the shared problems. I mean, that strikes me as because the elephant at sea again is Russia, but it doesn't seem like there's one of the things you guys identify is that there isn't really a forum or ability for these other countries to really coordinate their outlooks and efforts. Is that the case? And
yeah, so there was or is, you know, BSEC, the Black Sea Economic Cooperation Organization, but again, as you know, elephants at sea, its functionality always fell short of, I think, what its members hoped, and especially now with the war, you know, the idea of the Russians and Ukrainians sitting together at a table to talk about cooperation in the Black Sea just seems far-fetched.
Right, Lisa.
Yeah, I think I want to just add one of our recommendations, which is quite broad in the paper, is about building regional connectivity that bypasses Russia. And I think when I think about that, it's about infrastructure investments. You know, we have 3 Seas initiative. It's about, I think there's plans for an EU cable to Georgia, pipeline infrastructure, especially north-south infrastructure. These are the sorts of efforts that I think will make a difference. And also with, as I said before, the more sophisticated intelligence gathering and sharing and helping to build regional awareness, as a common picture, if you will, both amongst NATO partners, Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, but also with Georgia and Ukraine.
Now, there's clearly been a clamor from some countries, you know, Ukraine, Moldova, Romania, for greater NATO-U.S. engagement in the region, but that doesn't quite seem the case when you have countries like Georgia or Turkey. Is there, you know, how should the U.S. Identifying the Black Sea is critically important? How should it begin diplomatically to kind of engage in this area? What steps do you think it should be taking?
I mean, one of the things that we talked about in the report was encouraging more minilateral cooperation in the region. So this kind of gets to the question you're asking about regional fora. I think it's probably the case that you're not going to get all of the littoral states together at the table, even, you know, sort of leaving Russia aside, to talk about or to agree on, you know, some of the key steps that we would think are necessary for regional security and stability. And so I think to the extent that you can think about ways of doing kind of coalitions of the willing among states in the region to focus on things like information sharing, infrastructure investment, intelligence, ISR, all of that would be helpful. And I think having that flexible geometry also means that you don't have to focus on organizations and organizational charters and structures, and you can be sort of adaptable, you know, depending on what the issue at stake is.
I can also add, when I was in the region for this research, there is a need for U.S. presence, and I think senior leadership engagements is particularly important. I don't think before Secretary Austin was there had been many for some time. I think in particular about Bulgaria at the moment and the political turmoil that it's been through. Right now, there's a chance for some normal politics, for some stability with Euro-Atlantic leaning partners in Parliament. Bulgarians voted to begin to provide military aid to Ukraine. I think when we see these steps being taken where the regional allies are strengthening themselves and their commitments to their Euro-Atlantic path, this is the time to engage in those, to have those leadership engagements, and while also trying to maintain a balance so that it doesn't become seen as external influence in political affairs. So it's a delicate, this is statecraft, I guess, figuring out how to engage and consolidate the steps that are being taken by these by NATO allies without fueling Russia's information warfare.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in on that, the developments in Bulgaria in that sense seem to be really fairly positive. There are other places, around the region where, I think the momentum is in the opposite direction, and I think it's important for the U.S. to remain engaged and to focus on, helping countries that do face, political backsliding or an increase in Russian influence cope with that or counteract it. Georgia in particular, this has been problematic. I was talking before about the Georgian government's kind of attempt to thread the needle when it comes to dealing with the war to avoid provoking Russia. But I think in a lot of ways what the Georgian government has done has gone well beyond that and has actively sort of gone over into the side of supporting the Russian war effort. And now you have a big effort around the question of Georgia's accession path towards the EU. Joseph Borrell was in Georgia recently and talked about the steps that Georgia needed to undertake to get candidate status, which was denied last year. Now there's been almost a backlash against that effort, and you have members of the ruling party who are very strongly criticizing Borrell, criticizing the EU for external interference in Georgian affairs, and that sort of narrative is being fueled by the Russian information environment that exists in a lot of Georgia, and it's kind of reinforcing the message that members of the ruling party are making about how the EU doesn't seem to want to let Georgia in, so it might as well look for a different path. So I think dealing with and being sort of vocal and involved in those kind of issues of democratic backsliding are really important. And, Georgia is going to be problematic in that sense because of where the government is. But another example is Moldova, which isn't a Black Sea littoral state, but is all but. And there's been some very positive political developments over the last year or so. But you've also had a Russian-initiated backlash. The Moldovan government recently expelled a large number of Russian diplomats who were accused of exceeding their mandates. There was an election in the autonomous region of Gagauzia, which saw a victory by a member of a Russian-supported party that called for establishing a relationship with Moscow. So, even though Moldova's made real progress politically, was granted EU candidate status, and has taken steps to decouple its economy from Russia, I think the political fragility and political vulnerability is still a real problem. And so as much as we're talking about developments in Ukraine, I think paying attention to the vulnerability and the possibility of things going catastrophically wrong in, say, Moldova and certainly Georgia is something that really needs to be high on the agenda as well.
No, I think one of the things that the report does really well in the recommendations is emphasizing the importance of supporting our democratic partners and supporting democratic resilience. And I think when you take a country like Georgia, really since 2014 in particular, or 2008 when the war occurred, that I think there was an expectation there would be more investment, there'd be more support, and what we're seeing in Georgia, but also in other countries in the Balkans, that as the prospect of EU, NATO membership sort of drifted into the distance, so did effort to sort of stay on the democratic path.
Could also say the same thing about Turkey.
Yes,
incidentally.
no, I think that's definitely the case. But you also saw with the effort to have a foreign agents law in Georgia, and then the protests that took place, that it's not clear cut where Georgia will head, and I think that requires sort of very astute U.S. and European engagement and continued engagement in Georgia and the region. Unfortunately, that's all the time we're going to have for today. I think I really want to commend both of you for what is, I think, a really important and fascinating report. It's called The Inhospitable Sea, Toward a New U.S. Strategy for the Black Sea Region. Jeff, Lisa, thank you so much for writing a report and for being here. And thank you so much to our viewers online for joining us today. As a reminder, if you haven't subscribed to our program's two podcasts, Russian Roulette and the Eurofile, please get out your phones right now and hit subscribe. And please give us a rating, 5 stars, much appreciated. But those podcasts, you'll get more of these sorts of conversations. And I think anyone watching this or listening to this would really enjoy those. Lastly, I do want to highlight that our program here at CSIS is offering an executive education course titled Beyond the Battlefield, Global Implications of Russia's War in Ukraine. The course is going to run from November 1st and 2nd of this year, and the deadline to apply is October 18th. Please go to csis.org, click on the executive education page, and be sure to submit an application if you're interested. It's going to be a really fascinating conversation. I will be there, but don't let that deter you. There'll be other great experts as well. But thank you so much for tuning in today. And Lisa and Jeff, thanks again.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, and thanks to the support and video team for all their hard work.
Yes,
too.
Absolutely.
They do a
Thank you.
tremendous job, especially with the maps. So thank you all. Thank you.